talk about the Paris Agreement in very glowing terms. And rightly so, because that was the first time countries of the world came together and agreed on something. Now, that something is nothing, if you ask me, because if you take the sum total of the Paris Agreement commitments by all the signatory countries, and if all of it were to be implemented, we'll still be headed to 3.2 degrees of global warming by the turn of the century.
Welcome to the Blue Circle. It's such a big privilege and pleasure to connect with everyone. It's with everyone and our distinguished keynote speaker who is handpicked because of the think input and the rich experience he brings in. Thank you also to our distinguished audience for joining us, most of whom are CEOs, CXOs, and senior leaders. Many of them are our members and are repeat visitors to our webinars. This is very encouraging and motivates us to provide even higher levels of dialogue through the online mode as well. For those of you who are new with us today, Blue Circle is the world's first sector-specific networking platform for industry professionals that's built in India. We currently focus on 20 sector communities, such as e-mobility, renewable energy, banking, healthcare, and many more. We also present socioeconomic insights, which ultimately determine the evolving complexion of the market. Along with our weekly webinar series and our digital publication, you will be happy to know that we have recently launched the first version of the Blue Circle app for industry professionals. Somewhat like a sector-specific LinkedIn, a space to have meaningful conversations, connect with over 15,000 plus like-minded leaders from India and across the globe, house high-quality curated content, and access business opportunities across these sectors. Now, without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce today's keynote speaker, Mr. Satya S. Tripathi. He's the Secretary General, Global Alliance for a Sustainable Planet. A development economist, lawyer, and changemaker with over 40 years of varied experience, Mr. Tripathi is the Chancellor of Kalinga Institute of Social Sciences, the world's largest academic institution dedicated exclusively to indigenous people and cultures. He's also a Senior Distinguished Fellow on Innovative Finance at the World Agroforestry Center. He has served with the UN for more than 2 decades in key positions across the planet and was recently the UN Assistant Secretary General, Head of New York Office at UN Environment, and Secretary of the UN Environment Management Group. His other strategic engagements with the UN include Head of Human Rights. He's chaired a few communities on laws, treaties, and administratives, recovery coordinator for ACE and NIAS, and the system office established by the UN Secretary General in 2011 to facilitate the implementation of $1 billion REDD plus partnership between Indonesia, Norway, and other stakeholders. And for today's topic, Mr. Tripathi will be discussing future of sustainable banking, outlook for 2023, achievements so far, and targets planned. Now I request Mr. Tripathi to please begin the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and I'm delighted to be here, and a very good evening to the audience. Let me start by framing the challenge, because sustainable banking is only a solution, and the challenge is far bigger than what sustainable banking can possibly solve, but it certainly is a very potent tool in our toolkit to deal with the humongous challenge of climate change, environmental degradation, and ecosystem disintegration that we are seeing now on a planetary scale. People often talk about the Paris Agreement in very glowing terms, and rightly so, because that was the first time countries of the world came together and agreed on something. Now, that something is nothing, if you ask me, because if you take the sum total of the Paris Agreement commitments by all the signatory countries, and if all of it were to be implemented, we'll still be headed to 3.2 degrees of global warming by the turn of the century. And there is little evidence that any of the countries that have signed up to the Paris Agreement are doing that with the right kind of intent or intensity. Some countries are indeed meeting the commitments they made. But then again, the critics say that maybe they promised too little, because there was no standard, there was no measure, there's no verification. It was what is popularly called the nationally determined contributions, which means in layperson terms, a country decides what they want to do. If they don't want to do anything, that is their NDC. And then, you take all of that. So there's no common standard of performance. We see, if you look at carbon footprint per capita around the world, which is, I think, a very fair measure of a country's impact on global warming and the climate change challenge. If you take countries like India, the climate footprint or the carbon footprint is about 1.9 tons per capita, whereas the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change mandates that if we get to 2.1 tons per capita, then we'll be net zero. So in that sense, by per capita terms, India is already below net zero. But of course, in emissions terms, in absolute emission terms, India is the third largest emitter in the world. Now, if you take the case of the United States, it's roughly about 16 tons per capita. So if you are a critique, and as a critic, if you are making a critical analysis of the contributions of different countries, you might say that this is equivalent to a person that is eating 8 hearty meals a day, teaching somebody that doesn't even eat 1 hearty meal a day how to conserve and how to do better. So that's basically summarizes the challenge. There are a set of countries that are both historically and in terms of current emissions primarily responsible for the climate change challenge, and also that there are a large set of countries, the developing countries in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, and then that includes India, which are on their upward trajectory in the development curve, and they simply do not like the idea of doing much because they are not responsible for the situation. And that's scientifically borne out as a fact, not as speculation. So that's the challenge. And in terms of taking that a little further, in exponential terms, what is happening is that within the last century, we have gone from 350 parts per million of carbon concentration in the atmosphere to now roughly around 422. And then that is something we haven't been in at least 3 million years. So that's where we are. And of course, there are the smart people, but not so smart, that say, oh, if it was not like this in the last 3 million years, why are we not seeing more damage yet? The answer is simple. We have done it so fast that sometimes you do something terrible and the effect is seen subsequently, or sometimes you do something terrible and the effect is seen initially slowly, and then the collapse happens rather suddenly. It's the latter. And so we have increased the emissions so quickly that there has not been a chance of a commensurate disintegration comparable with the increase in emissions and the level of global warming. But the signs are showing already. Polar ice is melting at 35 times faster than it had been 30 years ago. We are worried about the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, but we need to keep in mind that what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. Just a few weeks ago in Siberia, as the permafrost melted, there was a reindeer carcass that came out as the ice melted, and people gathered around it. And then within a few hours, there were several people dead of anthrax poisoning and many more ending up in hospital. And we thought we had limited anthrax to biosafety level 4 labs, as we have done with smallpox and other diseases that had taken a great toll on humanity in the past. So that's the challenge. As the ice melts, the bacteria that has been there for millions of years will come out and find new hosts. So we had a fighting chance against COVID-19, we wouldn't even have a fighting chance against all kinds of pandemics that will come up in all kinds of geographical jurisdictions. And of course, the warming, the cyclones, the hurricanes, the tornadoes, the untimely floods, the bushfires, the forest fires, one could just go on and on and on. And that's the evidence. And what can we do about it? Of course, people very interestingly talk about, we need to stay under 1.5 degrees. I think that's very false hope. There is no staying under 1.5 degrees because we will breach 1.5 degrees by 2030, 2031 at the current rates. This year, we are past 40 billion tons of carbon emissions in 1 year, the largest since the time we started recording carbon emissions for ourselves. So at this rate, we'll breach past 1.5 degrees, not by the turn of the century, but in the next decade itself. And I would love for anyone to challenge me on these facts. And they're scary, and we really need to do everything we can to prevent it. Now, can it be prevented? No, you can't prevent us getting to 1.5 degrees. There is simply no evidence of change in human behavior at the scale required to stay under 1.5 degrees at any point of time. We're going to breach past that. But can we stay under 2 degrees? There's a strong possibility that if we act, we don't go to sleep like we have for the last 3 decades, we have a fighting chance. And that will already be catastrophic, but maybe we have an outside chance of coming back, because we are known as a species for its ingenuity, for its ability to invent our way out of a crisis, to find our resolve in the worst of times. So there are a lot of good things about our species. That is why we're at the apex of the species pyramid. And so not the worst things. I don't want to focus on the worst things. We have thousands of those. Greed, to say the least. And then, of course, jealousy, hating people for being better than us. There's all kinds of things that are wrong with our species. But at the same time, the good things are that we can innovate, we can create, we can think positively, and we have compassion when we want to. So what can sustainable finance do? Sustainable finance has grown exponentially in recent years. What is sustainable finance from a layperson's perspective? Sustainable finance is deploying money in a way that you do not endanger the future generations and the natural resources that they might have access to. Banking started with finance with a purpose. In 300-400 years ago, when the banking sector emerged, it all started as community banks. People will pull in money, for safety, of course, but also for that money being used for community infrastructure that everybody could pay for, and then the money goes back to the bank, and that's how then, of course, it took hold in different parts of the world. In the earlier days, money flowed from one part of the pot to the other, which is what when you had kings and royals, so they held the treasury on behalf of the people or on behalf of themselves, depending on how they ruled. And then, of course, all the taxes and everything went there, and then the money flowed back. There was no community finance happening that would then multiply the impact of that treasury 1,000-fold in different parts of the community, in different parts of the country, which is what we see now. And then banking lost its sense of purpose a few decades ago when we started creating papers and structures and hedges and all kinds of things where you might have one asset, but it might have changed hands on paper with 20 different people, one buying and the other insuring and the third hedging, and it goes on, and that pretty much explains the 2007-2008 financial crisis, the mortgage crisis, as it is popularly known as. So I'm going to put forward 2-3 ideas that I think could be very helpful. The first challenge, of course, it's an idea and a challenge articulated alongside. The challenge is that if you take the case of Europe, Europe has roughly 85% of the global sustainable finance flows, and it's good. But at the same time, if you drill down deeper, it is primarily renewable energy, and ancillary sectors, because although it started as a very uncertain idea more than 2 decades ago, renewable energy has now taken roots, literally, in every possible way. And if you look at the recent solar auctions anywhere on the planet, they are beating thermal power derived from fossil fuel sources such as coal and other similar sources literally by a mile, both in terms of CapEx and OpEx. So in terms of, and when I say CapEx, yes, the CapEx is a little more in the beginning, but I'm talking in terms of amortization over a period of time, and the certainty of amortization, the depreciation, and everything else. So as a package, both CapEx and OpEx wise, renewables are scoring way better, both, of course, in sustainability terms, but also in plain brown economy terms. They are beating the other forms of energy generation handsomely. Now that's a great thing, but the challenge is that money needs to flow as much to the other sectors of the economy as it is trying to mitigate the emissions from energy. And that sector is agriculture. If you take the top employers in the world, let's say take the steel industry, take the automotive industry, take the IT and the IT-enabled services industry and all their ancillaries, it's roughly about 35 million jobs worldwide. If you look at agriculture, it's about 1 billion jobs worldwide. It pretty much not just feeds the world, but actually sustains the world in terms of 1 billion people sustaining themselves. And they are also some of the bravest entrepreneurs. If you look at the smallholder farmer, it is perhaps the bravest entrepreneur because his life vacillates between one crop cycle to the other crop cycle. And in doing so, if they were not brave, all our land will be fallow. Nobody will be cultivating anything because the work is extremely hard in the harshest of conditions. And those of us that have a life in air-conditioned rooms and that use our intellect to move things around, we need to have great respect for these billion folks that actually toil very hard to produce the food that sustains the planet in more ways than we understand and appreciate. So if money were to flow into that, there are great examples in India. The state of Andhra Pradesh started this idea called community managed natural farming program. They have 6 million farmers. And as of now, they have converted more than 1 million farmers to natural farming. They do not use any synthetic chemical fertilizers or pesticides. And yesterday I was at a third-party independent study that has been conducted, and I was at the presentation of the preliminary findings. It's astounding. The yields are higher on average across the state. Electricity utilization intensity, because everything is paid for by the government, farm electricity subsidies, which is more than $1 billion per year in Andhra Pradesh. That's dropping by almost 50%. Water use intensity for chemical farming is 50% more on an average as compared to natural farming. Ecosystems are coming back literally with a vengeance. Bees and birds are nesting in agricultural fields. Those of you that follow the life of bees, you would know that bees do not nest in agricultural fields because the pesticides have neonicotinoids that result in their colony collapse disorder. So bees do not stay in agricultural fields. So when they come back, they are the best proxy indicator of a healthy agricultural landscape. And also they're storing carbon by the millions of tons through sequestration and also through reduction credits because of no fossil fuel-based fertilizers, no pesticides, less use of electricity, improved use of water, and one could go on, including exponential gains in public health. So money really needs to flow into that. That's the first idea I wanted to share. If it can get to the smallholder farmers and create a cold chain for them to store their things, India could create the world's largest clean food market, and not just lift its entire population out of poverty, but also become the $5 trillion economy that we've been talking about, but have made little progress towards. The second big idea is that, like in portfolios, you are able to tell your portfolio manager, for those of you that have investments in the primary and secondary markets of the world, that you make that choice. Do I want to buy this stock or do I want to invest in that bond? You make that conscious choice. Either you do it, or you tell your portfolio manager to do that, or you make those choices when you are ticking the boxes while putting in an investment in an SIP or in a mutual fund or anything that you put your money in. Banks need to start creating green savings accounts where you don't need to do these green bonds and other things. And that's useful, that's very important, and that has helped a lot. But this has to become a people's movement. If there are any smart bankers listening, you could be first off the block. Just start a green savings account. It's simple, not rocket science. Just tell your client, your account holder, that whatever money you put in this savings account will only go into green investments. It will not go into tobacco. It will not go into fossil fuels. It's not going to fertilizers and pesticides, all those things, And there's a whole world of investment out there that you can actually put that money, start a revolution, start a movement. That has the power to save the world. That's the second big idea I wanted to focus on. And the third is that as champions within your own spaces, you do not have the luxury of sitting back and saying, oh, you know what, this climate challenge, somebody is going to solve the problem. Nobody is solving the problem. And now the fire is at your doorsteps. If you don't, and when you have the power to make those decisions as to where the money should be deployed and then where not, as finance sector professionals or as entrepreneurs, as investors, or as people that even make simple investment decisions, do I want to do this, or do I want to, you just want to put up on a new plant in your facility, even if you're not a banker, and you're making that decision, please look at all kinds of technologies. Don't look at what is cheap. What is cheap is actually very expensive. If you look at the true cost of food that we eat, the meal that we eat actually costs 5 times to produce for the planet. If you factor in all the costs, we get happy because we are paying little, but actually most countries take the taxes and put most of it into subsidies. So technically we are paying. There's no free lunch, although we would like to believe that. So that is the suggestion I would make. I would strongly urge you to become champions in your own little space, because a problem created by 8 billion people is not going to be solved by a few corporations or a few governments or a few finance sector entities. It will be solved by the 8 billion people thinking positively and thinking constructively to save our common home. And it's not just, although, I can be very moralistic about it, and I say, let's say, save the 8 million species and all. That's not what it is. It is about saving ourselves, because there are many species that will survive, like the cockroaches and others, no matter how bad the climate becomes, but the humans won't. And then that's why it is very important for us to be very selfish and look at what we need to do to protect ourselves. But again, there is the good thing there, that if we protect ourselves, we'll actually end up protecting everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Tripathi. Some very good notes taken from this. Things I just want to reiterate, things like how 1 billion jobs, which is catering to the farmers or agriculture industry, really is much more impactful than the cumulative jobs from IT, ITES, etc., or automotive, and how organic farming is actually decreasing the cost and making it a more sustainable environment for people. And also, you pointed out that 1.5 degrees Celsius is inevident, but you are saying that we can still make sure that 2 degrees not be touched through various forms of challenges which we take ahead. So on this one, I'll just quickly move on to the questions and take them up one by one. I'll start with Rahul Arora. He's saying, are banks strategizing to reduce emissions from their own operations?
Well, they are, but again, it's there are multiple layers there. To give you an example of Microsoft or Apple, when they tell you our emissions will be net zero by 2030 or 2035, they're actually telling the truth. But they're talking about their supply chains or their value chains. And that's tough, but that's what they're talking about. But do not forget that these corporations also have a few $100 billion deployed somewhere as investments. It is the same thing like Harvard University trying to be circular in their internal processes. The food in the student residences being recycled, that is the wasted food, or switching to renewable energy, or making the retrofitting the buildings to be more energy efficient in terms of cooling and heating. That's all good. But Harvard also has what, a $50-60 billion purse that they invest in different, so that's invested in fossil fuels and others. So if you're saying that I'm becoming sustainable and that I am actually doing the right thing, you're doing a part of the right thing. The bigger thing is hiding behind, and that needs to change. And I was having a conversation with some of the Fortune 500 CEOs last month when I was at the climate change conference in Sharm el-Sheikh, and this was my question to them in the panel I was speaking at. And I said, well, all of you might genuinely feel happy about what you're doing, but the real kicker is in what you're not doing. And what you're not doing is not telling your bankers, okay, I have $200 billion in my investment account, I am Apple, I want to make sure that none of it flows into any of these sectors. Until you do that, you're not doing the right thing. You're doing only a very small thing, which is important, challenging, but still very convenient for you, because the rest of your money is still damaging the planet. So that's where the challenge is. So banks, in terms of their own investments and all, are certainly trying to be more sustainable. But in terms of the broader footprint of all their account holders and all the money they put into the pot, what happens with that is still a big if and a big question.
Thank you. Move on to the next question by Akshay. He's saying, is it not true that Indian banks are fueling climate change crisis by financing coal plants? But can this be avoided considering India's dependence on coal for fulfilling its growing energy needs?
Well, the answer is not just Indian banks, all banks. If you look at, so there's an Oxfam study that came out last year. It talks about the dirty dozen. So the top 12 banks of the world, and most of them in the United States, of course, Chase, Bank of America, Citi, and what have you, they have put around $2 trillion in new fossil fuel investments. Now, a new fossil fuel investment would, any industry expert will tell you that it will take at least 40 years to amortize that investment, get the returns and get your money back and all. There is no 40 years for the planet or for the human species to turn around the Titanic. So when a bank is putting money, they are criminally negligent, not just that they're making very bad decisions in terms of what will turn out to be massive crisis of stranded assets, but they are also being criminally negligent in terms of the planet and the people that they are professing to serve. So it's not an Indian story, it's a global story. Well, the difference is that in India, it might be coal, but in other countries, it's fossil fuels, it is shale gas, it's fracking, which is perhaps even much worse. So the challenge for India is that, can India do this given its energy needs? That's a geopolitical conversation. And if we get into that conversation, then of course, India is perhaps right, because we've just seen, because of the Ukraine conflict and the impact on the energy supply flows, it is happening in Europe. Even a country like Germany, who's really serious about climate change and has been doing the right thing for a while now, goes back to coal. So that's the challenge, you have to cater to your population. Of course, in Germany, the challenge is even more serious because in winter, if people don't get heating, they die. So it's not getting to cook in a better medium or a worse medium, or getting your energy supplies in a tropical country like India, where it might be uncomfortable. But then again, a predominant majority of the population lives uncomfortably without any even electricity or a fan, let alone air conditioning or anything else. So there are these challenges that one needs to be mindful of. But then, if you are determined, you will find the solutions. India wasn't much talked about 10 years ago in the solar space. I mean, we were doing some things, and that was helpful, but nothing extraordinary. Look at what happened in the solar space in the next 10 years, since 2012. It has been an extraordinary growth in that industry, and also other renewables like wind, and the like. So if you put your mind to it, I don't see how we can't find a solution. That's the unique ability of the human species.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Move on to the next one by Shania Oberoi. She's saying, how are government banks doing an upskilling, doing on upskilling the workforce for green roles, which is ESG reporting and accounting, climate risk calculations, etc.?
I think they're doing much better than what they were doing earlier, but still nowhere near, I would say about 1% of what they should be doing. There is certainly the desire to be better, but it is still primarily anchored around green bonds. And not every government bank has issued a green bond, only some of them. And that needs to change. And in terms of ESG reporting and all, it is still a very minimal reporting. There is no impact evaluation of portfolios. It's a negative list or a positive list. I'm going to invest in XYZ companies, or I'm not going to invest in XYZ sectors of the economy. It has to really grow manifold to a level where you are looking at both the input risk in terms of scope 3 emissions, in terms of supply chain emissions of big companies that banks are financing, because ultimately that will come back to bite the investments, because scope 3 emissions are an investment, are a responsibility of the company that is producing the final products and putting it out in the market. So, and that conversation is gathering momentum. Very quickly, those emissions will get latched onto the final product. And then when carbon has a true price, which I think should be anywhere around $100 plus, as opposed to the $20 it sells currently in the market. And I don't say this speculatively. If you look at the European Union, their internal carbon price is 100 euros. That's how they're budgeting it. So it's already there. It's just not out in the open market where people can buy and sell carbon credits for $100 each, at least. But that's a fair price. So that then will help the people that are doing the tough part, which is the smallholder farmers and others. They can actually benefit, and we can turn around agriculture from the energy intensive, water sapping, ecosystem destroying, saturating the chemicals into our landscapes kind of agriculture to healthy, naturally farmed goods and services that can then help our 1.4 billion population get to its true potential. So ESG is still at its infancy, in my opinion. It's still at the convenient place where you have some data that you can report on, and often people complain that, oh, I don't have the data, so I certainly can't report on it. That's not the right answer. The right question is, how can I get to the data that will then allow me to report effectively and meaningfully on a company's carbon footprint?
Thank you. Just a point though, you spoke of how organic farming is the way to go. Considering looking at how Sri Lanka tried its way to go into organic farming and they completely lost everything after that. How do you see countries like India or any other country in the world to completely switch to organic farming? Is it a viable option?
What happened in Sri Lanka is magical thinking and hubris. It wasn't based on science or economics. The political powers that we suddenly decided we have a foreign exchange crisis. So what are we importing? Oh, let's just switch all to organic. That's not how organic happens. India sets the best example of how to switch, actually. And by the way, what's happening in Andhra Pradesh is not organic farming. It's natural farming. It's regenerative agriculture. It's not compost. They do not use compost at all. That's very expensive. What they use is bioinoculants, very cheap, cow dung, cow urine, and 200 different biosubstances like buttermilk, jaggery, lentil flour as fermentation enhancers, and they increase the microbial content of the fluid a million times over a few days. And so that's what it does. They treat the seeds, they treat the soil, and they treat the plants without having to use any synthetic chemicals. But it is science. It is not our grandfather's old method of agriculture. It is the World Agroforestry Center, which is the world's leading research facility on agroecology, has done comprehensive studies now over the last 3-4 years. And they found that the yields go up. The input costs are anywhere between 20 to 50% of conventional agriculture. There's water conservation, and there's a species enhancement with all the species coming back to the agricultural landscape. So that's what it is doing. And it has taken them 7 years to get to 1 million farmers. They didn't wake up one morning and decided, oh, we stop bringing in. Even now, when they do it, it is not by fiat. It is by encouragement. It is by training. It is by building capacity. And even when a farmer is willing to switch, what happens is that the farmer is requested to switch only 15% of their land. Do it. See how it works for you. And then, of course, the second crop cycle, thankfully, unlike a tree that takes years to grow, in agricultural crops, the crop cycle is 3 to 4 months. So by the next crop cycle, the farmer already knows what happens when they do this. So then they are ready to switch to 50%. And then the third or fourth, they switch to 100%. So this is persuasion, not instruction, not a direction. And that is why it works. What happened in Sri Lanka it actually holds lessons for the entire world. Do not believe that you wake up one fine morning and you say, I'm going to switch systems. Systems have degenerated over decades. It is going to take you that much time, but with greater resolve and greater amount of resources, maybe less time, but it is certainly going to take you time. And you have to work with people, not by telling them what time of the day it is, but by telling them what impact their actions might, the positive impacts their actions will have on the rest of the planet. And that's what convinces people, because intrinsically, as a species, we believe in the positive. We might do all the wrong things, but we can always be brought back to the fine and the narrow and the moral path. But that needs engagement, that needs hard work, that needs capacity building, that needs training, that needs hand-holding. And you have to go to Andhra Pradesh and see what these women farmers do. They are simply extraordinary. They may not have money, but their resolve beats the best of the scientists and the best of the innovators, the way they go about it in a methodical and diligent way. That's why it has succeeded in India.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'll move on to the next question by Ashish. He's saying, what steps is RBI taking to promote green banking in the country?
Well, RBI, it started during Governor Rajan's time, and I was a part of some of those conversations 10 years ago. It is trying, and it is putting in different regulatory support systems in place, but it has to do much more. Let's say, if you have a bank coming up with a massive pot of money through green savings accounts, so as it relates to that pot of money, could the CRR be reduced? I don't know. So we've discussed all these things, as to what kind of support systems, what kind of incentives as the banker's bank, you can do as the Reserve Bank of India, because you are the lender of the last resort, and you are the regulator. So could you put in place those incentive mechanisms? So it will be a process of co-creation at the end of the banks, the scheduled commercial banks, or even the cooperative banks and others to come together and either individually, because if you take State Bank and others, they have size. So they really don't need 10 banks to come together. If SBI wants to do it itself, it can say, okay, I want to do these things. So you RBI, what do you think? What can you do to support me? Or it could be 5 or 10 or 20 banks. So it has to be a process of co-creation because there are challenges to be dealt with on both sides. So you can't just put it on the financial sector players or just on the Reserve Bank. It has to be developing something together, and initially slowly and then rapidly once you've seen the results.
Sure, I'll just ask another question, which by Ashish itself. He's saying that how big of a hurdle do you think sustainable finance literacy is for the transitioning towards sustainability?
It's a massive hurdle because people simply do not understand it. It is rather very easy, actually, but again, it's a whole economy anchored around the Brown economy principles, and we have taken a turn for the worse a few decades ago when we started creating these fancy structures where you really don't have to do anything. You're just playing the market. So it is not the old school of investment where you put money into something good and that grows. In the process, you also make money. And so that's the challenge. And so literacy, not just for the sustainable, not just for the finance sector professionals, I think sustainable finance literacy is equally important for the policymakers, for the people that hold the keys to critical decisions in the public sector, in the government. And so that's extremely crucial, actually, because this is like, even if you get the finance sector professionals, and to my mind, a lot of them are already very well educated in sustainable finance, but it's like you have a vehicle or you have something of a vehicle that is being driven by a Ferrari engine on one side and a Bullock on the other. It doesn't work. You have to have both the people that deliver these goods and services to the broader population, which is the financial sector professionals, but also the regulators and the government and the bureaucrats, everybody being on the same page in terms of literacy and understanding. And that's when co-creation happens. Otherwise, you're speaking to literally a wall. And that's a huge challenge around the world, not just in India.
Very true. I'll move on to the next question. Risha Srivastava is asking, how have banks done in analyzing the potential sources of climate-related risks so far?
They have done okay, but nothing that is desirable in terms of either size or complexity. Earlier, it wasn't there at all, but over the last few years, banks are looking at climate risks. Initially, the climate risk professional or the sustainability professional was a sideshow. In the banks, it still is in most cases. They have no, if I was running a bank, I would actually, every loan decision I make before it enters my loan books, it will go through the climate risk professional and the sustainability professional who must have a significant say in the matter, not intuitively or emotionally, but by providing the kind of evidence and analysis that goes into making that loan decision, and not just in terms of, okay, what's the input and what's the output and what's the internal rate of return and all those things that we commonly use. So that's one thing. The other thing that really isn't happening but needs to happen is that not to look at impact evaluation once the industry is up and running, but rather look at impact evaluation even before an investment decision is made. Okay, if this is the industry and if these are the plants you are buying, then X and Y companies have the same plans and they're producing the same thing, and this is their climate risk, or this is their sustainability risk, and this is what the carbon, once it gets latched onto their finished products, this is the kind of risk it will produce. So why are we financing somebody who's going to use the same old technology and the same old processes to produce a certain kind of goods and services? So that's what needs to start happening, instead of putting money and then looking at impact evaluation. Impact evaluation needs to start even before an investment decision is made.
Surely. I'm going to go on to the next question by Ranjan Roy. He's asking from the fintech point of view. He's saying, how is the fintech industry promoting sustainable finance, and how different is this from CSR?
Well, CSR is not sustainable finance. CSR is CSR. The government decided to have a certain percentage of the profits to be put aside for public good, and that is happening. But it's a good question, because if I link both, it's a fantastic opportunity. India spends roughly about $3 billion every year in CSR. So if a group of countries were to come together, or the regulator suddenly decides, let's say, well, you know what, we're spending $3 billion, very fragmented, all meant well, all doing a lot of good for the communities around the country. But why not we, let's say, set aside 20 or 30% of this money, or even 10% of the money into a climate fund, and this is your investment in that fund, and that fund will then drive sustainable finance or provide counter guarantees for people that are making climate sensitive investments, where the perception of conventional risk is very high. But the moment you get a 10, 20, 30% for top loss guarantee, then the investment becomes viable. And the market is willing to put in that money. And so the CSR it is a great force for good, in my view, but it can be a much greater force for good if you marry the potential of CSR with sustainable finance opportunities in India.
Surely. I'll just move on to the last question, and thank you so much for your time as well. Last year, the SBI and the European Investment Bank launched a new initiative of 100 million euros to finance high-impact climate activities. How have these funds been allocated so far?
Well, I don't think they've allocated much as yet, but the challenge is in the numbers. 100 million fund for climate impact investments in India is a non-fund, in my opinion. India needs, at the scale of tens of billions of dollars every year, to meet the NDCs that it has promised to the world. India's nationally determined contributions and the climate actions they entail would require anywhere in the scale of 20 to $30 billion every year at the very least. And the number will only grow as the climate degenerates further, as we are confronted with more and more challenges, either flood or droughts or warming or cyclones, the whole gamut of challenges that India has. And not to forget the air pollution situation, which is that out of the 30 worst cities in the world, 21 of them are in India in terms of air pollution. So that's a huge challenge, not just for the productivity and other things, but also for health of people. India loses 1.7 million people every year, directly attributable to air pollution. Dahlberg recently published a study in partnership with the government of India that pins down the number as $95 billion per annum is the loss to the economy from air pollution alone. So, so there's a lot of these things that need to be looked at. So the size of the fund is underwhelming, although they deserve all our congratulations for starting something, because somewhere, you need a spark and then hopefully things will move. I haven't seen the evidence of that. The investments haven't been fast as I would have expected, but I also realize that in the early stages of any fund, there's a lot of process and procedural stuff that has to be dealt with. You have to develop an investment pipeline, and those things do not happen overnight, not unless you are thinking magically, as was the case of organic agriculture in Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tripathi. Such an insightful and engaging session, and a privilege to hear you. Our guest, I have been hooked on till the very end. And also thank you to the leaders in the audience for joining us and for staying till the end, for sharing excellent questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.